I'm going to have to again apologize to our panelists and members as a result of the clock not having worked. It affected our pace. General Breedlove is going to have to leave us. General Breedlove, thank you so much for participating in this panel, and we appreciate the rest of our panelists' flexibility that they're able to remain with us. Mr. Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to just appreciate everything that all your service to our country. The ranking member had a question regarding our relationship with China and the potential for misinterpreting some of their actions or miscalculation on their part or our part. And in an era of advanced data, right? We have a lot of data. We can still misinterpret that data. Somebody sending an email to one person to another. One person reads it one way. Oh, no big deal. They're asking for this. Another person is insulted by that same email, and that's people with complete information. What was shared on that screen? How do we prevent that that misinterpretation, that miscalculation? How do we take into account the cultural differences and understandings between China and the United States? And I'm thinking about this in relation to the Cuban Missile Crisis, that there was a drastic miscalculation by the Soviet Union on what our response would be when it came to placing missiles on the island of Cuba. And after that, what was established? The hotline. I hope we don't get to a point where we have to do it in that way, where there is such a near catastrophe that because we all misinterpreted and just calculated each other's responses. That what can the intelligence community do? What can Congress do to make, and what can the executive do to make sure that doesn't happen? And it's an open question for everybody.
Yeah, I'll start, and my mates will fix it. On this issue of misinterpreting information, that is fundamentally the craft of intelligence, right? Is to take what is uncertain and try and put it in a framework that allows people to deal with it with certainty. At its best, that's what it is. At its worst, it makes mistakes. When General Petraeus talks about training and education and investing in humans, it's to make sure that that piece is done well. When we talk about competitive analysis, not just one center that has a voice, but more, it is to try and beat out bias that even with every piece of training you have can creep in. When I talk about data, it is easier to find the truth when you look at it from more angles. The more sources you have, the more, so that's where data can come in and help us. As far as the misinterpretation, we've talked about military channels. There are intelligence liaison channels that try and have that conversation that is below the surface of policy to make sure that you are never losing connection, so you always have that opportunity. And then the last is, I think, to just see clearly what is, to not judge it as whether it's good or bad, but to try and understand what it is the best way to get there. But this is hard in a fast world because these disciplines right now are disproportionately manual on disproportionately small data sets, and we have to move that along. Great question.
Yeah, I think it's establishing communications with a potential adversary where you can, having developed an understanding of the adversary, which includes cultural appreciation, if you will, and ideally you actually have procedures and guardrails, which is what Secretary Blinken was seeking to advance in the visit that had to be canceled or rescheduled. Keep in mind, for example, when we had a near confrontation, we had a confrontation with the Wagner Group elements in northeastern Syria, we had communications established with the Russians. And we used those communications. They were very forewarned before we attacked that element that was coming at us. Now, it didn't prevent them from continuing, but it ensured that they understood what it was we were doing and why we'd done it. They had literally crossed a certain physical line, and when that was crossed, we were going to take action, and we did. So again, I think it's those elements that are crucial to this kind of issue.
Congressman, the only thing I would add is the difficulty of speed. Speed of decision-making is very different than it was for the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that makes it harder for decision makers. One of the things that means, though, is that you need to get those connections often at a lower and more tactical, non-policy level. I was forward as the Secretary. I visited one of our command centers in Iraq when the air picture there included United States and allied forces from multiple countries supporting indigenous forces on the ground fighting ISIS in Syria that was being supported by the Russians, and the Russians were in the same airspace. We had an open line with a couple of young airmen who were native Russians who had emigrated to the United States and were in the United States Air Force to try to make sure, and in that space, so we had the Russians watching us who were watching somebody else on the ground, and the Russians didn't know it, and there was also an F-22 watching the Russians who were watching us watching the ground. So extremely complicated, fast-moving, and there's no substitute for that direct communication when needed to ensure that there's no miscalculation.
No, thank you.
Mr. Gomez.
Give me something to think about. But thank you for answering. And Dr. Wilson, I want to take you up on that offer from your opening statement to have more conversations about. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. This is quite the esteemed set of witnesses, and it's been very exciting to hear from all of you. General, it's great to see you again. I wanted to comment openly and wonder aloud about the CIA personnel development problem. That wasn't something I was aware of before, and perhaps the committee might consider as a first step simply facilitating CIA personnel having access to the very large resources that DoD already does. The DoD would love that because as those of us who sort of we're in that world of the intelligence community on the DoD side, we would love more engagement with the CIA since they're in charge, and it's quite helpful.
It actually has the access. It can send people to staff colleges, war colleges, NDU, all the rest of this. The problem is it doesn't have the time. The tasks always are greater than the number of personnel available, and there is not a personnel allocation allowing this to happen. That's the problem.
I see. I do want to move on to. I'm going to list these questions rather quickly, and then hope that you all can answer them. So, moving south of our border, how does the intelligence community view the Mexican cartel fentanyl issue? Is it viewed as a national security threat? Is it viewed as a drug issue? Is it viewed as a law enforcement issue? Who is the lead on this? Number two is, do you view China's role in providing the basic components of fentanyl as a deliberate intent by them, or is it more of a convenient opportunity to degrade us in our society? Number three, does the IC commit adequate resources to Latin America, and especially with respect to countering China's influence in Latin America? General, I'll start with you.
I think the regard would be a national security threat, and you have the coordination of the response to that really is the chief of mission. Now, obviously, you've got DOJ, and you have DEA, you have other departments and agencies in the government. The challenge, I think, there has been the erosion of the trust and coordination and cooperation between the Mexican government, frankly, and our U.S. organizations. When I was privileged to be the director, as Sue will recall, we had a very close relationship. We were providing enormous assistance. Each time there's a new president, they go through a new process, if you will, and they're surprised at how much of this was going on. This particular president in Mexico is so hard populist that there is not that kind of relationship. And so there have been a number of public stories, in fact, about how the most important relationship eroded because of a variety of factors within Mexico, not from our part. China's role, I think it's probably both deliberate and convenient, equal parts of that most likely. In Latin America, no, I don't. I think this is the economy of force theater that has always been the economy of force, and that's not adequate. But again, there are limited resources. You have to prioritize, and it always ends up being the last of the geographic regions, even though it's the one closest to us. And the source, if you will, of many of the real illegal immigration problems that we have, either from certain countries in that region or actually now coming through South America, through the Darien, and up through Central America into Mexico and the border.
Congressman, let me just, there is a joint task force that is set up to support tracking transnational cartels. And there is also an intelligence fusion center that is intended to try to support that. Both of those are at Fort Bliss or in El Paso. And if you'd like to come out, I'll buy the enchiladas.
Sounds good.
And another one
Great
actually
plan.
down in Key West.
Dr. Gordon, if you'd like to add.
No, they said it very well. I will say the intelligence community, particularly the CIA, has had a long storied history in terms of crime and narcotics, countering narcotics. I think it is more effective potentially now because we have better relationships with domestic agencies than we did in the early days when we tried to do it only with our authorities. And I think General Petraeus said very well that we have some of our best officers and best relationships in South America, but it is resource limited compared to others.
And maybe my last question would, if I can fit it in really fast, would be, the Department of Defense has a vast amount of the intelligence community resources. Does it have the proper authorities to really collect on the cartels the way we would need to?
I think it does because, of course, you can use Title 50 as well as Title 10, as you know. And a lot of what goes on in certain activities can be actually under that headline. So it's led by the, if you will, CIA covert action authorities, but it can still be conducted.
Yeah, counterterrorism taught us a lot about
Yep.
sharing authorities, and so that's well.
Yep.
But it does have to be in conjunction with the CIA when that happens.
Yes, and of course, keep in mind, of course, if it's out overseas, it's the CIA is the lead organization for that kind of activity.
Excellent. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to serve on this panel. And I want to thank our panelists today for your outstanding testimony and service to the country. And Dr. Wilson, it's good to see you. We shared our affection for George Bush 41 on the White House staff together, and a real affection for a former Air Force General, Brent Scowcroft. So it's good to see you today. I'm an economist. I'm a banker. I'm not a war fighter per se. But my experience tells me, in both my government service and my work here in Congress for the past 8 years, that if you want to get bad guys, you cut the money off. So I hope I bring that perspective to this panel. And cutting off the money means you have a really impressive economic forecasting and international assessment capability of people's economics, their sources of funds, where those funds go for and where they go to. And of course, we know that through the massive use of sanctions in the last 15 years. But I'm reminded of a great guy when I was a young Senate staffer, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who used to rail on the floor of the Senate about the CIA, quote, repeatedly getting it wrong about major political economic questions. For example, he said the IC systematically has misinformed successive presidents over the size and growth of the Soviet economy. And that was a big theme for 40 years. So this idea, I want to pose it to you. How are we doing on assessing China's economic statistics? I'm told in the private sector, not so good, but General Petraeus, you've been in uniform at the CIA and now global business at KKR, and all three of you, I think, bring a great perspective to this. So talk to me about how we do in the IC of forecasting economics, because if we're wrong, we spend more money than we need to spend here in ramping up a defense organization that we may not need. So let me yield to you, sir, for your first thought.
Well, I actually think we are doing better than when it came to the challenges of trying to divine what was going on in the Soviet Union, which was obviously not just a closed economy in many respects, or centrally central economy, but was also very difficult to pierce. You'll remember Churchill, who described, what is it, a mystery within an enigma within something else. And I think that was true of that time. I think it's very difficult to hide some of the data that is freely available nowadays when you look at China. And in fact, it's use of that data that has enabled not just the CIA. I would actually look outside at the economic analysis firms that do this very, very well, that can look at the number of whatever it may be indicators and say, see, that's not really GDP indicative of GDP growth of what they say it is. It's probably a percentage, 2% less than that. So I think there's so much more information out there now that if you can harness that, analyze that, you can come to much better conclusions about, say, the Chinese economy than you can, I think, about we were able to do about the Soviet economy.
Thank you. Ms. Gordon?
Yeah, I think you're sitting on the skill set that's the core of the realm. I think we're better than we were. I think we're better than we were when the Trump administration started. I think there was an advantage to having a businessman who came in demanding and questioning the work that we did in econometric and economic analysis. And we got better during his tenure. We invested more in resources. I think the point about the data that are available makes us have even greater potential to get good at this as the intelligence community learns that it does not have to be limited to that intelligence which it collects and curates. This will come. So I think that there's this recognition that this is an area where we were disproportionately political military analysis, and now we see this. I would say there's something you can do. What I noticed was the intelligence community typically went to the National Security Council, and the Economic Council was a different meeting with much less tethers. Bringing those two closer together, if you can help enable that, I think will help further this.
Very helpful. Dr. Wilson, you also talked about open source. All three of you talked about more open source analysis. So your thoughts?
I also think that some of the better analysis on this is actually done open source in private companies that are looking to support business in and from China, and that's a great place to leverage what's going on outside of government.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, and we're going to conclude with Mr. Waltz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to be with you all. I'm going to start with you, General Petraeus. The definition, at least definitionally, of a Cold War, as I've looked across a number of pieces of literature and doctrine, is an adversary that's using all elements of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, economic, to supplant another. By my definition, that's exactly what the CCP is doing. So from your perspective, has the CCP, has the PRC entered into a Cold War with the United States?
I hesitate because the term, I think, is challenging because the context is so very different. Certainly, there are activities that are very similar to those that took place during the Cold War between the USSR and the U.S., the East and the West, if you will. But the context in which this relationship is being carried out, again, China and the U.S. and the West, is so extraordinarily different. I mean, they're one of our top three trading partners. And so I'm cautious about just saying this is another Cold War, and it evokes all of the actions that we used to take. We had no economic interchange of any meaningful.
Some would argue that actually makes it a much more dangerous.
Well, it's a much more challenging.
Cold
It's just
War,
much more complex because they're dependent on us, we're dependent on them, supply chains, all the rest of this. There are enormous vulnerabilities on both sides. And so we cannot, I don't think, for example, decouple from China. That's just not practical. We can selectively, and should, and we are, selectively restricting certain exports. I mean, the IP, the fabs, and the chips for the super chips and so forth, a whole variety of areas. And again, to come back, what the investment community needs is specificity. What can you do and what can't you do?
Just for the...
But we can't completely decouple. That just would be...
For the sake of time, I think there are many powerful entities in Wall Street, in the investment community, in sports industry, in Hollywood, and academia that don't like that term. You could say coupled, that's a polite way. I would say they're making, everyone is making a ton of money, which is an adversary like which we've never faced. But when we have the leadership of that entity with which we are now dependent, openly talking about defeating capitalism, defeating liberal democracy, and replacing it with their vision of the world that they then seek to export globally, I think actually the term Cold War could generate a lot of positive responses in terms of a wake-up call that I think we need across the government and American society. And in that vein, what do you think the PRC and the CCP fears the most? Do you think they fear some additional capability or deterrent, or is it internal and they fear their own people? And if it's the latter, during the Cold War, we supported dissidents, we supported authors and civil society, and I mean, these people were household names, these Russians who bravely were standing up, solidarity and so forth, but we don't seem to have that approach either in the military or even in the intelligence community. It seems to really scare a lot of people, or you have those other factors that are pulling us away. Should we have more of an irregular warfare and perhaps a human rights-focused approach to have the CCP looking internally rather than externally?
First of all, I think it's very appropriate for this committee to get into what it is that actually is being done, and I wouldn't assume that we're not doing a fair amount of this kind of activity. But to get to the question, and I'd actually put it with respect to Russia as well, I think what Russia fears most is an example of what right looks like in Ukraine. It fears a vibrant, economically successful democracy next door, which would show the citizens of the Russian Federation what they could have if they could jettison the kleptocratic regime that has been running Russia for over 2 decades now.
I completely
and I think
agree.
The same is true with respect.
I think what they
to the
feared
People's
was Hong
Republic.
Kong, and they feared that model, right?
And us. And of course,
Taiwan.
they're seeking to sow division,
Right.
seeking to exacerbate differences and all the rest of this.
Just last remaining question, and I'll just take it as a follow-on. Under the 2017 National Intel Law, where everyone, every business, every Chinese citizen is mandated to collect what they are told to collect, does that essentially turn the 400,000 students that are here, the Confucius Institutes, business people, technology trade, I mean, anyone essentially into a collector? And that's not racist or xenophobic. That's amazing, wonderful Chinese people and culture, but they don't have a choice in terms of what they're told, if told, to collect. And if you could just address that.
That is true if compelled.
Yep.
I think the issue of humans, individuals, particularly those over here, is not as straightforward a question as TikTok and Huawei.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologize for going over my time. I yield.
Thank you very much to our panelists. I greatly appreciate you're the kickoff for our committee, and this is going to be very important to us as we focus in the upcoming year. Thank you for being here.